right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. As we celebrate Black History Month, we are thrilled to have this webinar presentation for today for your viewing pleasure. We have King's Dream, Jefferson's Predictions, Views on Anti-Blackness with Harvey Bakari, and he is the president of the Bakari Historical Services. Just a couple of things, a few reminders, I guess I would say. This is going to be interactive. There are a couple of poll questions that we will launch throughout Harvey's presentation. So be prepared to participate in those polls. And Harvey has also mentioned that he's going to have specified breaks in his presentation where he can address questions throughout. So we just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Please throw any of your questions in the Q&A and feel free to use the chat as well. But I guess without further ado, I want to pass this over to Harvey so he can move into this webinar presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm Harvey Bakari, and I'm glad to be here to present this presentation to you today. King's Dream, Jefferson's Prediction, Views on Anti-Blackness. I'll tell you a few things about myself in just a moment, but with this particular presentation, I wanted to compare some of the words of Thomas Jefferson, thoughts of Thomas Jefferson and Martin Luther King when it comes to the issue of race. One thing I was doing as I was looking at what I wanted to include on my website, I was wondering if I was going to offer diversity and inclusion. But then I thought about the fact, I said, let me do a little bit more research on this first. And I noticed that there was a particular trend when I watched some videos and so forth, that there were some people who were uncomfortable with the topic of race and slavery. Well, I spent 23 years talking about race and slavery at one of the nation's largest living history museums, Colonial Williamsburg. And so I just want to give you an idea, because some of you may be familiar with the Colonial Williamsburg. It's in Williamsburg, Virginia. If you're not familiar with the East Coast, or you don't frequently come to the East Coast, you may not be familiar with Colonial Williamsburg. So I wanted to put together a little video to give you a sense of some of the things I accomplished at the museum. It's a large living history museum that has about 88 restored buildings from the colonial time period, when Williamsburg was the capital of Virginia, the largest and most powerful, well, the largest and most wealthiest of the 13 colonies. And also, it has many interpreters, of which I was one, as well as the manager. And so let me just move forward and show you just a few, just to give you a glimpse, just in case, again, you may be in another country. Colonial Williamsburg has lots of visitors. But I was a manager of African-American interpretation, so I managed staff, a diverse staff, a farm site, an urban site. I also was a reenactor on stage, or an actor. I wrote and directed a program that was presented for 11 years. I also directed a military reenactment, and also traveled to West Africa a few times, particularly to Senegal, with a museum exchange program. And we did some exchange with history of the slave trade, as well as the history and culture of Senegal as well. So that's just a quick snapshot. You can go to Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's website. It's an excellent museum. If you happen to be on the West Coast, on the East Coast, you may want to include that as a place to visit as we get past this pandemic. But again, Bakari Historical Services, you see my contact information there. I'm working on the website, which will be coming soon. But let's get to the question of the day, the question of race, according to statements by Thomas Jefferson and Martin Luther King. Now, with my 23 years of experience working in the History Museum, one thing I noticed is most people start history in the 19th century. They will start with the arrival of the first Africans in 1619, and then they skip all the way to Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Abraham Lincoln. Most people start the history right there, but you're missing the 1600s and the 1700s. And by missing the 16 and the 1700s, there are some things that will surprise you as to how many of the practices of that time period is still with us today. So we'll see that as we go along. So I'm going to take you back to the 16 and 1700s and work our way back up to the 19th century. So first, I'm going to cover in this section, again, as was mentioned by Emily, I'm going to be doing 2 sections. Then I have, this will be about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A, which is my favorite part. I like answering questions and engaging with people, because what I was involved in is called public history. It's a type of applied history where you take scholarship and you engage people face to face with the scholarship. People from all types of backgrounds, you have no idea where they come from, but it's your job to engage them, to provoke them to think more, as well as to research more. So I'm going to be covering a few comments, quotes by Jefferson and King on the issue of race, as well as I'll be giving you a quiz in which you will have to determine if a person is Black or white. You have 3 seconds to vote. And then I will wrap up that first section looking at the origins of anti-Blackness and some of the Black voices of the 18th century. So let's take a look first. This is a little bit out of context, but let's look first at Thomas Jefferson. One of the statements he made, which was very profound, at least I believe it's very profound. He said the 2 races, and in this case, he's speaking of Blacks and whites. The 2 races equally free cannot live in the same government. Very profound statement. On the other hand, let's look at Martin Luther King. At this phase of Martin Luther King's life, he's not the 1963 I Have a Dream Martin Luther King. He's the 1967-68 anti-war. He's speaking of international affairs. He's have many people who were with him before, many white liberals are not supporting him anymore. He's not as relevant as he was. 70% of whites thought he was irrelevant. 50% of Blacks thought he was irrelevant by that time period. But this is something he said in his last sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he was talking about his last sermon, which was played at his funeral, was a portion of it, was the drum major instinct. And he said, do you know that a lot of the race problem grows out of the drum major instinct, a need that some people have to feel superior, a need that some people have to be, that they are to be first. I'm going to paraphrase it. And also he goes on to say that while that they feel, I'm having a little time reading, they feel that their white skin ordained them to be first. So excuse me for stumbling over that particular slide. But let's put that into context. What is Thomas Jefferson talking about? Let's look at Thomas Jefferson, some of his views on race. Now, this was an important issue after the American Revolution. One of the things he said, he believed that Blacks, or I should say, were inferior to whites in the endowments of both body and mind, and that would be a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. He's not the only person who believed that, but he's Thomas Jefferson, and people would take notice. Further, how would he address the issue of emancipation? He said that there's nothing that's more certainly written in the book of faith that these people are to be free. And then he goes on, that's when he says, the 2 races equally free cannot live in the same government. So let's direct the process of emancipation and deportation in their place filled by free white laborers. Now let's take a look at Martin Luther King, the contrast. Again, this is the same statement, a similar statement that I read before about the race problem and the need to feel superior. The drum major instinct he was trying to make in his last speech had to do with the fact that people have an innate need to feel superior. It makes them feel better than other people. I would recommend, if you get a chance, to read the entire drum major instinct sermon by Martin Luther King. And so he would go on to say a few other things. He said when he was in jail in Birmingham, he had a discussion with some of the segregationists. and they would sit down, they would have discussions and go back and forth. And he said that the important thing here is that you are put in a position, as hopefully you can read this yourself. He said, you are put in a position to support your oppressor. You fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in American society oppresses poor whites. And the only thing he has going for him is his false feeling that his superiority because his skin is white. And he can hardly eat and make a living week in and week out. So he was always appealing to the oppression of poor whites as well. All right, now those particular speeches were some insights on Jefferson and Martin Luther King's perceptions or thoughts, if you will, on the issue of race. Now we're going to start a poll. In this poll, you're going to use your eyes and your brains to determine whether this person is Black or white, because our brains cannot see. Our brains are in our heads, right? Our skull. But it's the light, the reflection of light on an object that goes into your eyes, sends a signal to your brain, and then your brain interprets it. Now, I'm also a visual artist, so I know this as well. I'm not a scientist, but I am a visual artist. And so I'm going to start. It's 8 images, and you guess. The poll should be up. You should guess if the person is Black or white. You'll have about 3 seconds each. Here's the first. Okay, is that square on the screen?
Oh, yes, hold on.
Let's see if we can move that.
See if I can move
We can move it to the side, to the left, or to the right.
Oh my, hold on,
Let me see if I can move it on my screen.
Oh, that would be great.
Oh, I can move it. Okay,
good.
Let me go back then. Let me see if I can go back. Let me go back. Okay, let me see if this will, okay, here we go. All right, let's begin. Here's the first one, Black or white. Here's the second, Black or white. Here's the third. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. 7. And 8. All right, before we get to the results, I did want to cover some things that your eyes cannot see. Your brains cannot interpret when you look at a person. When the light reflects on them, goes into your eyes and then into your brain. One of those things you cannot see is a person's genealogy, what their ancestry, and genealogy, they call it your admixture. You can't see that with the eye. Let's see, the poll. Let me see if I can move that poll. Is it still visible?
Harvey, I do have to tell you that is my apologies, but I think the poll didn't work appropriately for folks. I think it wasn't your fault at all. I think it's because they needed 8 poll questions in this first poll, since there were 8 individuals. So they were only able to vote for the first one, is my understanding. Okay.
Well, when I show them the results, they'll be able to virtually take their polls in their mind.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So genealogy is one of the things that you can't see with your eyes. When it comes to genealogy and family, not everyone knows their family tree, but for African Americans in particular, did something just cover my screen?
No, I can see everything just fine right here on my side with the family tree.
All right. Let me just remove something, just jumped on my screen. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So with genealogy, everybody doesn't know their genealogical chart, their family tree. There's an old saying, if you shake your family tree, be careful what falls out, or who falls out, not what, but who. But for African Americans in particular, the 1870 census is very important. It's like ground zero, because that's the first time the majority of former slaves are recorded as citizens of the United States, them, their families, and marriages. This is the go-to place for many African Americans to begin their genealogy, because the history of slavery and race was so fragmentary on many Black families. Now, the other thing you can't see with your eyes when looking at a person or glancing at a person is their DNA. Now, these circles that you see on the chart here on the West Africa is where the major places where Africans were captured and sold across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade. But recently, in addition to commercial DNA, and this is my DNA results, I'll tell you a little bit about this chart in a second. In addition to commercial DNA, there have been university and scholarships that are researching the connection between DNA and the transatlantic slave trade. So what you see on this chart, and I don't represent, full disclosure, 23andMe, but it's the one that I use. As you look on the chart, the first thing you see along the top, you see the circles. They represent time periods. That's a timeline of 40-year increments. Average lifespan for people before the 20th century was about 45 years of age. Underneath, you see these colored bars. Now, I don't know if you can read what's on it, but that's considered your admixture. Those are people in your ancestry who previously lived in a society where they were pretty much homogeneous. Therefore, they could leave a long genetic marker in your DNA. And so by looking at this chart, you can see that people who did not have a lot of admixture, when they enter into your DNA. Now, I've been able to use my genealogical research to cross-reference this and in fact, support the fact that I did have one of my great-great-grandfathers said that his father was from Africa, and it would have been somewhere within the timeline of the first and second chart. And I also know that there's another African ancestry. But I'll talk about that a little bit later, and we can talk about it if you want during Q&A. But you also notice that I have some European DNA. And that's not a surprise for many African Americans like myself, because of the history of slavery. When you see European DNA in your ancestry, it makes you wonder if it came into your ancestry by consent, or most people think maybe it's rape, it was rape, or many people don't think of the fact that perhaps that ancestry came in from a white female and a Black male. And we'll talk about that as well. Now, the other thing just to keep in context is you're looking at these different groups that are coming to the Americas, well, particularly Europeans and Africans, obviously Native Americans and indigenous to the Americas. I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. When do you think Africans imported, what was the median, I'm sorry for that. What was the median arrival date of Africans into British North America or the United States? You could think about it for a moment, just guess. The answer, 1770. That's when the majority, if you were to average out all of the Africans who were brought to the Americas, it would be 1770. What is the median arrival date of Europeans to the Americas? Give you a chance to think about it. 1900. If you put together all of the Europeans who came to the Americas, as a matter of fact, there's been research to show by David Eltis on the slave trade that up until the year 1820 was the first time the ratio between the arrival of Africans and Europeans began to even out. Most Africans were crossing the Atlantic in the slave trade than Europeans until 1820. So when you're looking at the time period of the founding fathers, the founding nation, the 1600s, the 1700s, the demographics was much different than you think of today or during the time of the Civil War. Now, here are the results. Even though the poll didn't work, here are the results. We've got the first person, he was Black and enslaved. Number 2 was white. Number 3 was white. 4 was black and enslaved, 3 was white, 6 was black and enslaved, 7 and 8. Okay, now you can determine what your answers were, but let me tell you a little bit about this results, and then I'm going to have to move a little bit faster so I can finish this first segment. Number 1, the 4 brothers here. You probably know this from their surname that they're brothers. They are white, but actually they were mulattoes. Oh, let me tell you. Okay, what happened is their father, his name was Michael Healy. He was an Irishman. He immigrated from Ireland to Georgia. He had slaves. He got a plantation from slaves. He took one of his slaves named Eliza to be his illegitimate wife because he could not have a legal marriage with his slave. But he did not want his children to live as slaves. He knew as mulattoes, they should be in the tobacco fields, working with their aunts, uncles, and cousins. So he made arrangements. As each child reached the age of about 5, they would be sent up north and pass as white. They would be sent to a Catholic seminary in Boston. And there they would pass as white. So one after another. What were they able to accomplish living as whites? Well, first, Patrick, he became the president of Georgetown University. His brother, Alexander, he had the most trouble. People thought he looked a little bit like maybe his mother. They thought maybe there was some mixture there. James was a Catholic priest. He had a white congregation in the state of Maine. And Michael, he was in what is equivalent to the Coast Guard. So those are things they were able to accomplish, even though technically they were mulattoes and they were slaves. Now, in terms of the Africans, one of the things that most of them had in common, except for Phyllis Wheatley, even though Phyllis Wheatley may have had this in common, is that they were Muslims. And as Muslims, you know, most times people say Africans don't have a writing traditions, that slaves weren't taught to read and write. That is if you eliminate Islam. If you take Islam into the equation, then you would know that they were Africans who could read and write. Some of them also knew Greek. They were being trained in places like Timbuktu. Islam had been in West Africa since the 7th century. Phyllis Wheatley, who was captured at about the age of 9, she was from Senegambia, which was another region of West Africa that had many Muslims. Her ability to learn to read Greek and Latin and the Bible and become an international poet may have been influenced by her coming from that part of West Africa. Now, I'm just going to show you a few things at a glance because time doesn't permit, and I want to get to your questions. But one thing that was not in the self-interest of Europeans was African history and culture and civilizations. The only thing they wanted to promote is that Africans were heathens and should be, as heathens, that they should be Christianized and civilized. These are some of the skills that Africans also brought to the Americas during this transatlantic slave trade. Now, that was valuable to the traders, but again, they wanted to promote them as heathens and savages that needed to be Christianized and baptized. Again, just at a glance, not all Africans in the Americas were enslaved. Some of them fought, created independent communities. Sometimes they formed alliances with Native American communities throughout the Americas. Very quickly, you have the beginning. What was the origin of anti-Blackness? So I want to talk a little bit about the Spanish in the 1600s. This is their empire. This is just to give you a sense of how important religion was. Again, this is another topic that made people uncomfortable, but religion was a big part of justifying the slave trade, of capturing Africans as prisoners and taking them to the Americas. This was written by a Catholic bishop who was upset about the abuse that Native Americans and Africans were subjected to in Peru. Also, as the technology of the printing press began to develop, or advance, I should say, European philosophers developed ideas of race, scientists, and theologians began to establish that Africans were the cursed descendants of Ham, using Genesis 9:25. As the cursed descendants of Ham, they were to be servants of servants forever. This gives you a quick glance at the wealth that was built from the slave trade. The larger the circle, the more slave ship voyages occurred from those regions of Europe. At this point in this diagram, the Northwestern Europeans were dominating the slave trade over the Spanish and Portuguese. You can see Bristol, London, and Liverpool were the major British slave trading countries. Also, you can go to London today. You can also see some of the buildings that were involved in the slave trade, the wealth and the power of the slave trade from the Bank of England, Lords of London, who insured the human cargo. I have a friend, James Walvin. He's a historian in England, and he said back when he first started studying the history of the slave trade, his fellow scholars laughed at him. They said, "Oh, that was not relevant at all. That was just marginal." But once the scholarship in the 90s started to occur and come forward, they laughed at him no more. Now, also, just to show you just how respectable the slave trade was, here is an account by Captain Slave Ship, and this is I have one more slide after this, and we'll open up for Q&A. No, two more after this, and open up for Q&A. Here's an account by a slave ship captain named John Newton, and he talks about the fact that when you bring 200 of stout men torn from their native country, will rarely resign themselves to their situation, and they will try to gain their liberty, and we receive them on board from the first as enemies. Now, I wonder, do you know who he was? John Newton, does it sound familiar? Oh, let me give you an example. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. He is the author of the hymn, Amazing Grace. And when he transported Africans across the Atlantic, he was a Christian slave ship captain. There was no contradiction between religion and the slave trade. It was respectable at that time period. So I'm just putting it in historical context. I know today we look back on it and people may become a little disturbed by knowing the role of religion, but that was the 16 and 1700s. Now, very quickly, some Africans were, particularly early in the slave trade, they were branded. This branding obviously spells race. What does it mean? The Royal African Company of England. So imagine the irony of an African wearing that or being branded with that on his or her body. And lastly, I want to give you a little voice. You probably know about Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre, but the Blacks in Boston were also a little bit more active than just the Boston Massacre. And they wrote about their feelings, the first generation. They talked about how they were taken from a populous country and enslaved in a Christian country. You can also look that up, the Boston petition. There were several that they sent to the governor. So we're going to take this moment to begin the Q&A. And I put up a slide just to have some of the topics that I covered. And so we can take about 10 minutes to address your questions and our comments.
Absolutely. I have a few questions in the Q&A, and then I did see some things in the chat. So if there was something in the chat you wanted me to address, please make sure to pop that in the Q&A for me. Michael asks, how did MLK Jr.'s views evolve from 1963 to 1968? I think it was one of your quotes in the beginning.
One of the ways it's evolved, number one, he became influenced by the more militant people, such as people who are involved in the Black Power movement, Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael. They began to influence him. And he also began to see, particularly when he decided to speak out against the war in Vietnam, many of his white liberals, they abandoned him. Many people in his own organization, they abandoned him. And that's why he was not popular by the time you get to 1967 and 68. He became popular once he was assassinated and people started burning and had riots around the country. But prior to that, as a matter of fact, by 1967, in an interview on NBC, he was questioned about the I Have a Dream speech. And he said himself that he thought the I Have a Dream speech was superficial. So within that time period, between 63 and 67, like most people, he evolved. He's getting older, he's 38, 39 years of age. but really there was a lot of influence by some of the other militants in the African civil rights movement, and particularly young people, because there was a lot of generational divides. And that's why I really should say the civil rights movements. There was not one, there were movements, and they formed alliances with various people. Okay.
All right, thank you so much for that. Barbara asks, would you please share more information about how the median date of arrival was calculated? Is there a way you can share that information?
What I'll have to do is send, I forgot to put that citation on that particular slide. It was taken by scholarship in the 1990s. They were looking at the median arrival date, but also and I do have a citation on the David Eltis, and his book on the slave trade. They also talk about the fact that 1820 is the time period where you start to see an evening out between the number of Europeans and Africans arriving. Because remember, on those slave ships, some of them are bringing over 200, sometimes 400, sometimes 500 Africans at a time. And you compare that to the amount of Europeans that are coming over as the colony is being developed. Because not everybody wanted to come at the very beginning. And once for instance, with indentured servants who came here, once the economy improved in England, less indentured servants began to come to Virginia in the 18th century. They didn't stop, but less came because there was a better economy after, I think, the Great Fire.
And then I have another question from Negus in the Q&A. Wouldn't the Moors' conquest of Europe be an older date regarding anti-Blackness? The Moors in Europe is one that's very debatable. That's not my expertise, because the racial admixture in North Africa is very, very diverse. And sometimes there's some people who want to say all the Moors were Black, but now certainly there was the term blackamoors that referred to those who, according to your eyes, looked African. But there was a lot of admixture in that part of Africa, but they were, particularly amongst Muslims in North Africa, there's a lot of admixture there. But one could make an argument after they expelled the Muslims and Jews in 1492 from Spain, that could be the beginning. As a matter of fact, I would have to spend a little bit more time on it, but I would say, good point, yes. Okay, great. Michael asks, regarding the median dates of arrival for Africans versus Europeans, do we have estimates on the total numbers? Or maybe there's a source that they can investigate further for?
Well, the total number of Africans used by most scholars that can be documented was 12 million Africans were captured. About 11 million survived the voyage across the Atlantic and what's called the Middle Passage when they were brought to the Americas. Once they arrived in the Americas, another percentage of them would die because, for instance, those Africans who had to go to Peru, once they survived the Middle Passage, they had to cross the mountains to get to Peru. So some of them did not survive that as well. So, so again, the general numbers are 12 million captured, 11 million survived in the Americas, and others would die from other experiences once they were imported into the colonies.
Okay, and then I do have one more in the Q&A. Charmaine asks, how was the ideology of passing established and implemented?
We're going to cover that in the second part.
Okay.
So if that person has a follow-up question, put them on the top of the list if they have a little bit more. I'm going to cover that in the second part.
Okay, great. And right now, our Q&A is totally taken care of. There was someone with their hand raised, but if you do have a question, you have your hand raised, feel free to throw it in the chat for me, okay? All right. Harvey, I'm going to turn it right back on over to you.
Go over back to, okay, let's go on to the second section. All right. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to have to move through this fairly quickly, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why I focus on Virginia, the evolution of the slave society, and the American Revolution, the paradox it creates, which is the race problem, breaking the back of segregation, and then Martin Luther King's dream. I'll put it into perspective. Okay, one reason why I focus not primarily, but not exclusively on Virginia, the 1600s, 1700s, is Virginia was a slave society dependent on the labor of about 42% of the population, Black and enslaved. It's also the home to 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. George Mason was considered the father of the Bill of Rights. So there was a significance of the colony of Virginia. These Virginia families, not by coincidence, became powerful figures, and the founding documents are attributed to Virginians from the 18th century. Now, the circles you see on the chart there, that represents the amount of Africans imported into the 13 colonies. The larger the circle, the more Africans. Now, I know when you look at South Carolina, which has Charleston, which has a very rich heritage, but when Virginia and Maryland, about 50% of all enslaved people went to that region. It's just that those circles are concurrent. They're compounded. They're on top of one another. But you could also look in the north, and you can see places like New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island also. One of the difficult things I had to interpret with guests or visitors was the fact that there was slavery in all 13 colonies in the colonial period. Most people, again, think of the 19th century and only think of slavery below the Mason-Dixie line. No, every colony, 13 colonies, practiced chattel slavery. All right, now, very quickly, how did this develop? It wasn't always, anti-Blackness in this British colony was not always instant, if you will. It was very flexible at first. The colony was founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company. Then by 1619, the Virginia General Assembly began to manage, or I should say, govern the colony. The Church of England was the established Church of Virginia. The government was a church and state government. This was a Christian colony Protestant. They were very concerned with Catholics. They were also Spanish in the territory. They were Dutch up north in New England, New York. So the Europeans are fighting over control over the land, as well as they're fighting over control of the slave trade. There's constant competition going forward. But this is the first permanent settlement. So you've got 3 major labor groups, or interracial unfree labor source is what many scholars would say today. You have Native Americans. I'm using some of the 18th century terms, so that's why you see Indians. Some of them were term servants, some were slaves. For whites or Europeans, some of them were voluntary, others were involuntary servants who would work for 5 to 7 years in exchange for their voyage or transportation from Europe to Virginia. And then the last group, of course, were Negroes and mulattoes. They were either slaves or indentured servants. Now, at first, the gentry, which was the ruling class, they didn't really care too much that the workforce was interracial, but they became concerned about the possibility of them forming alliances. One of the reasons, they worked together, they ate together, they lived together, and so what do you think happened? They had family together. So there was a lot of interracial mixing. As a matter of fact, after they served their time, it was not uncommon for former Black and white indentured servants to intermarry, as well as there was intermarriage, of course, with Native Americans. And we're going to get to what happens. Now, eventually, the Virginia General Assembly is concerned. They want to make sure that these alliances do not occur and do not continue in the colony of Virginia. And so one of the things they want to do is close the loophole for Africans to escape slavery, because 2 things made Africans vulnerable. One came from the exercise that we did earlier: visibility and vulnerability. They couldn't go back home. They couldn't get back to their homeland. So that made them easily identifiable. So the first thing they did is they had to establish, let me just back up. Many times people address the history of slavery from the perspective of adults. but really some of the basic laws of slavery were addressed towards Black babies. In this particular case, if a white man, particularly a slave owner, has a mulatto child with an enslaved Black woman, well, we already know the status of the Black woman, she's enslaved. The question became, what is the racial identity of that mulatto child? So the Virginia General Assembly passes a law that says the child takes the condition of the mother. This made slavery hereditary by birth. As the baby comes out of a Black woman's womb, that child is enslaved and it will be passed on to their descendants until slavery would end. Next, another question came up. Many of the Christian slave owners said, well, what if I baptize this little baby, Black baby, in the body of Christ? Well, I have to free them. Once again, the Virginia General Assembly steps in and says, nope, baptism does not exempt them from bondage. Therefore, you can go about providing spiritual salvation for your enslaved children and adults, and therefore use their bodies while they're here on earth. So again, there would be no contradiction between owning slaves. Now now I'm addressing the question that came up earlier. What happens if a child is born between a white woman and a Black man? If we follow the law, the child takes the condition of the mother. And so in this case, and this occurred, I should say this very quickly. Relationships between Black men and white women occurred much more than people would think. Many people start history, like I said, with Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. They start way in the 250 years later. You're too late. That's 249 years that there were opportunities for Black men and white women to have relationships. But by, as you can see, 1691, the Virginia General Assembly and other colonies began to make interracial marriages illegal. Now, so when you look on your DNA chart, if you happen to have a chart, I brought my chart back up again, you can see the European heritage in my DNA. Now, it could be that they were the results of the rape of Black women, but they also could be the result of a relationship between Black men and white women. And I know many of you are probably, every time I do a presentation, talk about this particular topic, people are like, but no, wouldn't that be lynch? What would happen? Trust me, it was tolerated, but it's not until the formation of the Klan and the movie Birth of a Nation, where this idea of protecting the white woman came about. But they were 250 years too late. You can go into your DNA, you can find out. Now, for many African Americans, as I said before, we're not surprised to find European ancestry. But imagine if today you're white and you get your DNA results and you've got a small or large amount of African ancestry. It's possible, just like the Healy brothers, that at one point, one of your ancestors was a Negro or mulatto, well, a mulatto, who after several generations became either one, passed as white, or they could go to the courts and prove that they met the stipulations, because each state had different stipulations for who's mulatto and who's white. And then your family becomes legally white, take that secret to the grave, and never tell their children, so they'll never look back. So again, that's why the old saying says, if you shake the family tree, be aware who may fall out of that tree. I may touch on that a little bit more. But one last point, one can argue, and I argue, that the children, the mulatto children born between Black men and white women, were the foundation of the free Black community, because those children, after serving 31 years, would become free Blacks. So particularly here in Virginia and in Maryland, that was the case. And those free Blacks were not, they appear not to be passive people. As a matter of fact, the governor, as early as 1736 of Virginia, Governor Gooch, he says, look, we need to fix a perpetual brand among the free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from the great privilege of a free man. So As I talk about the race problem, you'll see how that plays out. So let me move a little faster, so I know you may have more questions. And just a side note, it was 276 years before the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case allowed interracial marriages across the United States. Now, I want to walk you through the 1600s and 1700s. We're going to take a little walk, just a little quick walk. I want to show you how those laws are applied in everyday life. These are things you would learn from childhood to adulthood. You can just walk through and you can see things like this. First, on the right, you see a man with a stick, a gentleman with a walking cane. On the left, you see a Negro with a stick. That would be me when I was an interpreter. But that Negro has a weapon. In the hands of a white man, it's a walking cane. In the hands of a black man, it's a weapon. Any sticks or clubs were considered a weapon. So even though you have the same object, but if it's held by a white hand versus a black hand, the interpretation is two different things. He can receive lashes for that. Let's take another walk. Let's go a little bit further. Okay, these gentlemen have dogs now. So now you have a gentleman, he has a dog, his dog is a pet. You have a Negro and he has a dog, that's his pet. No, no, no. You know what that is? That's an animal that will attack sheep and other livestock. As such, you must put that dog to death. Now, just to let you know, for those of you who love dogs, I know there's many people who love dogs. Thomas Jefferson did not love dogs that much, except for his special breed dogs. When he found out that his slaves had dogs, he told his overseer to destroy them. So again, a dog is a pet when he's with a white man. He is a weapon, if you will, or danger. Plus, he will protect his master if he's with a Negro. So different interpretations for the same image. Now, this one should be easy to figure out. A white man with a weapon, he is a hunter, he is a patriot. A Negro with a weapon is a threat, a rebellion. The very first law to establish and use the word Negro was that Negroes should not own firearms. Now, just to give you a sense of what and how was that life internalized, I just created this list. I'm not going to go through it all, but you can glance at it and you can see the difference between the poorest white person and an enslaved person who's dressed in livery costume with a wig and he lives in the governor's palace. It doesn't matter. He and she are still enslaved. And here on this list are some of the differences between being free and being enslaved. Because sometimes I've encountered people who would say, oh, slavery, it was another form of inhumanity. It's like this, it's like that. I say, this is lifetime. It's hereditary. It's handed down. It's not one episode in an individual's life. This occurred over centuries. So you can see, particularly when it comes to protecting the body, rape, pedophilia, incest, sodomy, concubinage, no protection as a slave. Trials, conspiracies, self-defense, one cannot practice self-defense, travel, you can go down the line, holding office, and you might be, I should mention, you could also give a black baby away as a gift. So if you had someone you wanted to give a wedding gift, you would give them the baby of one of your enslaved people. On the last part, I just wanted to put that in. It's a little provocative, but it's true. Cadavers. Not only could you be used in life, your labor or for sexual pleasure, but an enslaved person also, their bodies could be used for medical research. Medical schools, there's a book by, I think his name is Wilder. It's called Ebony and Ivy. And it talks about the history of slavery in colleges and universities. And there's a lot of scholarship that's being done about the connection between colleges and universities, particularly medical colleges, which had access to black bodies, cadavers that they would use for medical experiments. So that's another part of being a slave. So it's, again, lifelong, generation by generation. But that was going to change. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. That was going to change. That was 150 years of hereditary chattel slavery, internalized by white and black society, also internalized by others that were coming to the colony. But the American Revolution was going to change everything. The American Revolution This is where the second poll, I forgot to say that to Emily, this is the second poll. Maybe it may or may not work, and I do have to move fairly quickly. So let's forsake the poll for right now. But what would you choose, the British or the Americans during the Revolution? Here's what the British are offering you. Governor Dunmore says he'll give you immediate freedom if you join the British in Norfolk, Virginia, and fight for His Majesty's troops. The Americans, well, they're not going to offer you a guaranteed freedom, but they have these new ideas of a new government that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So you might decide to go there. But let's say you decided, you want to go with the British. Let's see what happened. Well, with the British, Governor Dunmore, he assembled about 300 Black men, former slaves and free Blacks, and he titled them the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. And they fought on behalf of the British as Black loyalists. That was not going to leave Black women out. They were not passive. That was an opportunity for large thousands, eventually thousands of Black women, children, as well as elders to escape slavery and to obtain immediate freedom. So what was going to be the outcome? Well, after the war, obviously the British lost the war to the Americans. They had to evacuate, and they took the Black loyalists with them. Now, some of them they took out of the country as slaves, others left as free people. They left out of New York, Savannah, and Charleston. Their destinations were Nova Scotia, Canada, East Florida, the British Caribbean, as well as the Bahamas, and then others are England, and then others immigrated to Sierra Leone, West Africa. So about 20, it's estimated 20,000 left the United States. Now, suppose you were fighting for the Americans. Well, the British said that the Americans had speckled troops, which means that they encountered interracial groups like this, the Rhode Island Regiment. By the time they came to Yorktown in Virginia, at the siege of Yorktown with General de Lafayette, who you see on horseback, they were an integrated troop of Blacks, whites, and Native Americans. Now I'm going to move a little bit further. Oh, let me just go back real quick for a moment. I just wanted you to see that once again, the free Blacks in Boston, I moved too fast, sorry about that. The free Blacks in Boston, let's see if I can show you that. 6 months after the Declaration of Independence, they wrote another petition. And again, they said that this great number of Blacks apprehend that we have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom. So again, paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. So they were a very active community in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, free Blacks and slaves responded to the American Revolution. They built institutions and organizations, businesses, churches. I portray one of the founding members of the African Meeting House, which is today the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg. Also, notice the names of their institutions, the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, also the African Lodge No. 1, which are today known as the Prince Hall Freemasons, started out of the American Revolution. So now you have the American Revolution, I've got to move real quickly here. You've got all of the founding documents, but now you have the race problem because the question is, where do free Blacks belong? Where do they fit in American society? And the future question, just like Jefferson was comprehending, was where would freed slaves fit in American society? Now, there were many different thoughts. They thought, oh, maybe we can put the Blacks, the free Blacks, on reservations. We'll put them on reservations just like the Native Americans. But then they said, oh, no, the American Colonization Society said, no, why not send them abroad to the colony of Liberia? So for African Americans, particularly those who fought in the Revolution, they have a choice to make. Do you stay here in the United States and fight for citizenship, which is not guaranteed, or do you immigrate to Liberia or the Caribbean? The other event, there were 4 major events. That was the first one. The second one was many enslaved people were being displaced. 2 things were happening here. As the Louisiana Purchase, land is opening up to the West. Native Americans are being, through warfare, treaties, and Indian removal, are being moved out. Settlers are coming in with their slaves and building their plantations. So they need more labor. They're getting that labor from the upper South, states like Virginia and Maryland, and what's called the domestic slave trade. More American-born Blacks were sold from the upper South to the lower South than the total amount of Africans imported into British North America. But that wasn't enough for those plantations. So many of them, with the help of Northerners, like people from New York or the Brown family of Brown University, they began to illegally traffic Africans into the United States. The Congress ended the slave trade in 1808. So you see that star, I'm bringing that DNA up again. You see that little red star on that chart? 1808 is when the slave trade ended. So that indicates that I had ancestors, probably 2 or 3 Africans, who were smuggled into the United States after the slave trade. And again, many of those ships were outfitted by Northerners in New York and Rhode Island. Lastly, a quick glance, the free Blacks, they had a solution. Their solution was various conspiracies and rebellions, and many of them were influenced by the Haitian Rebellion. As you round out, almost on the eve of the Civil War, this question of the race problem, particularly for the pesky free Blacks, is answered in the Dred Scott case, where the Supreme Court rules that when the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was written, it did not include free Blacks, slaves, or their future prodigy. Now, Justice Taney forgot about the fact, or he just didn't mention, that free Blacks had fought in the free Blacks and slaves had fought in the American Revolution. Many of them had state pensions, federal pensions. Some of them had their discharge papers signed by General George Washington, but yet he ignored that to say that Blacks could not be citizens of the United States. Now, time is running out, so I'm going to just kind of move through the last part very quickly. And this is, I'm going to tell a quick story. This story is the story of Lieutenant Charles Hamilton Houston. He was a veteran of World War I. By the time he was in the military as a lieutenant in World War I, things had drastically changed. In less than 40 years, the progress that African Americans made had been lost. And so as a matter of fact, I'm going to just get through this. I'm just going to tick through it because I need to get to your questions. That's my favorite part, because you can see I could talk all day, but that's not my point. I want to engage with you and answer your questions. But you just move, I'm just going to tick through. He knew he was part of the legacy of Black soldiers who fought in the American Revolutionary War or the Civil War. After the Civil War, there was the effort of the United States to address the race problem with Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established those born in the United States would be citizens of the United States, as well as the Civil Rights Acts. By the 15th Amendment was the right for Black men to vote. That would also include white non-property owners, and another Civil Rights Act. So he knows it was less than 40 years, even though he served in the military, things had changed drastically. He knew that after Reconstruction, there were race riots, the formation of the Klan. They basically reversed all of the gains created by Reconstruction. And the court case was Plessy versus Ferguson that finally drove the nail in the coffin and established that separate but equal was legal. So he was going to work through the centuries. He got his degree from Howard University School of Law. Then he got another law degree, his advanced degree at Harvard University School of Law, worked for the NAACP, became a legal counsel, but he was also dean of the School of Law at Howard University, and he trained the lawyers to fight for social justice around the United States. And as you go through the centuries, various things, again, I'm going to tick through this because I need to get to your questions, but you look at women's suffrage. Let me just say it real quick, sorry. At the beginning, as looking forward from his time period, you had Birth of the Nation, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. You had the Red Summer as Black soldiers returned from the war. You had women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment in the 1920s. Then you had A. Philip Randolph, who pushed the federal government, he pushed President Roosevelt to abolish, or I'm not saying abolish, but push him to end discrimination in the government of hiring. World War II, Black men and Black women fight for the country. The executive order desegregating the military. These are little, it's like a small axe that's chopping at a tree. Slowly but surely, the Korean War, finally the military is, desegregation is actually implemented, but the big one was Brown versus the Board of Education. The white resistance brought out the symbols that we're familiar with today, Confederate flag, neo-Nazi symbols, swastikas, the idea of allowing Black children, whether going to elementary school or high school, to be in classroom with white children was an affront to white superiority. And they fought back vigorously, closing schools, in some cases, opening private schools. And so that's where the I Have a Dream speech comes in. But most people focus on the last part, his dream. But I just wanted to remind people, and this is the last slide, and we'll go to the questions. I'm sorry for going over a little bit. But many times people forget about what was he demanding at first. The issues he brought up were police brutality, travel and public accommodations, fair housing, segregation and the impact of segregation on Black children, voting rights, the enforcement of civil rights. And then he speaks of the dream. Now you can go and look up the dream yourself, the speech, I Have a Dream speech. It could have been called, instead, the Negro, we will never be satisfied, instead of the I Have a Dream speech. But again, those become overshadowed by the vision that he would later say was superficial. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm sorry to have gone over on the time. I know our time is pretty tight, but let's see if we got some questions.
Don't even worry about that, Harvey. Not a problem at all. First of all, I do have a few questions in the Q&A, and I don't mind folks hanging on a little bit longer. If you have some other questions, feel free. Negus asks, why don't we utilize the term prisoner of war instead of slaves? Were the vast majority forced into slavery?
Yes, prisoner of war is a term that I use occasionally because particularly for many of the African Muslims, they were victims of jihads. They were jihads amongst Muslims in West Africa and between the various groups. And so that's a prisoner of war. Mm. And the Schonberg Center, even their research shows that the scholars believe that the majority of Africans who were captured were not captured like Kunta Kinte and Roots, who was kidnapped. The majority were the victims of attacks, warfare. As a matter of fact, there's a book called The Barracoon, which was one of the last accounts of one of the last slaves who were imported into the United States. The last slave ship was in 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War. And he describes warfare. Thomas Jefferson, and his first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he had one part that was removed, but he attacked the king, and he said the Christian king of England were violating the natural rights of an innocent people, and he was taking them he was using war to capture them. So even Thomas Jefferson is using the term war. I think it's an effective term because it gives people a better sense of the fact that these Africans were taken by force. There's a tendency when sometimes people want to create a kumbaya moment and they'll say, we're a nation of immigrants. No, there are two things that happen when people make that statement. Number one, they've eliminated Native Americans, and Native Americans has faced many attempts to eliminate them by various legal records here in Virginia. They had to choose whether they would be Black or white. They couldn't even be identified as Native Americans, and that happened in different parts of the country. So that's the continuation of eliminating Native Americans who were not immigrants. Second, all of the documentation that I've seen from the 18th century, it would have been a contradiction to call the Africans immigrants, because that would be acknowledging that they are human beings on the same level as European immigrants. So there's just no place that I see in the documents that I've read where people are referring to Africans as immigrants being imported into Virginia or the 13 colonies. They're always referred to as immigrants. I'm sorry, not immigrants, as merchandise or imports, just like importing goods from a ship. So a very good point that prisoner of war is really a more effective term. And I learned from someone who worked in human resources a long time ago. He told me that words have perceptions. And so just using that word can help people change the perception and, or I should say, expand their perception of what an enslaved person was, especially those first generation of Africans who were prisoners, majority prisoners of war. So that's a very good point.
Bernard Greenspan mentions wonderful historical perspective, and he'd like to hear you talk about how to address the systematic component of racism today, but I'm sure that's probably a whole nother webinar.
Yes, yes.
And there are several, I'll let you comment, of course.
Well, I think we should look at Thomas Jefferson, if we want to cut through everything. I think we should look at Thomas Jefferson's statement, and do we answer that statement truthfully? He said that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. And when in our government, we have the federal level, of course, and we have the state level. And laws, there are certain laws that are obviously through history that were used to oppress African Americans, as well as other groups, Native Americans, Asians, Latinos, Jews, Catholics. But in particular, in this particular case, because he's specifying the two races equally free. He could have used Native Americans, but they were concerned about taking more of their land in the Western Territory after the American Revolution. So he says the two races equally free. So could we honestly answer that question? And it's my opinion that by the time Martin Luther King, we have the 1967, 1968 Martin Luther King, it seems like he's coming face to face, and he says it in his 1967 NBC interview, which you can find online, that America has never made a true, I think he said a genuine commitment to equality in the United States, that it's always vacillated between not quite doing enough. And he gave the example of, it was easy to beat up for the Northerners and liberals to beat up on the segregationists in the South. And they could vote for the Civil Rights, 65 Civil Rights Act. But those same politicians from the North and from the West, when it came to issues about housing, and suddenly that impacted their constituents, and they became resistant to the Housing Act that was signed after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So I think he was coming up to that realization, just in my opinion, that it's a difficult task. But to me, I think Jefferson, in my opinion, I think he kind of nails it. That we can be, because he didn't say, and I'll stop so we can go to the other question, because he didn't say that the two races equally free can't live together and have families and so forth. But he's saying equally free in the same government. That's the key question. And, but let's go on. We'll go to the next one, but that's a good question. Yeah, we'll take another.
That'd be a whole nother webinar. And exactly. I think this is probably a kind of, on the same topic with that, but do you see a need for a second Reconstruction period for the civil rights movement, given the revelations on January 6th insurrection? And yes, I know other people have brought that topic up, but I think something to that nature has to happen. Otherwise, everything is happening piecemeal, even though, for instance, prison reform, that's just on the federal level. Most prisoners are in state prisons. The federal government, the presidents can only do things that were in his purview. He cannot impact, well, they can in certain ways impact state laws, but states have their rights to create their laws according to their constituents and their needs. So even when, for instance, when interracial marriages were illegal, they were legal in some states and illegal in other states. But the Loving versus Virginia made interracial marriages legal in all states. So yeah, I would think there would have to be some type of reconstruction
in order to address the race problem. But I really believe even before there's a Reconstruction or reparations, it's my belief that there probably needs to first be a truth and reconciliation type of forum. It's something that Malcolm X once said. He said that we will never solve the race problem until the white man and the black man can sit down and talk honestly about how they feel about each other. They don't try to be politically correct or respectable. They need to get it out and have some type of truth and reconciliation. And so I think it's a series of events that need to happen. But those are just some of my thoughts, what of course are debatable.
And I do have one last question in the Q&A, and the question is from Natalie. She asked, is the recorded documentation of Africans that predated enslaved Africans by Arabs?
Say that last part again. I think
Sure.
you're talking about the slave trade in East Africa with the Arab slave trade.
I believe so. I guess, and Natalie, feel free to throw something else in the chat or the Q&A just for clarification, but she asks, is there recorded documentation of Africans that predated enslaved Africans by Arabs, is what it says. Okay.
Let me see if I can answer it this way. There's a couple of ways I can answer it. One, before the transatlantic slave trade, there was this trans-Sahara trade where African captives were transported across the Sahara to Europe and Asia. So that was one means. As a matter of fact, if you occasionally may see Blacks in Europe before the slave trade, that's how many of them entered in Europe. Also, in a place like, I'll give you one example, Lisbon, Portugal. Well, let me not move off the track. I want to say two things. One, the East slave trade of Africans being captured and taken to the Middle East is a little bit more complicated because they were Muslims, and under Islam, one can, through conversion, be freed in certain cases. And it's a touchy subject because sometimes people who were enslaved, particularly women, would marry into the family that enslaved them under Islam, under various Islamic cultures. So identifying slavery in the same way we do in the West is much trickier when you're looking at the Arab or Middle Eastern slave trade from taking mostly women from Somalia and Ethiopia. So that one's a little tricky, but there may be another part, what she's talking about, I'll make it very quick. Slavery became synonymous with Africans around the 1500s, because before that, in a place like Lisbon, Portugal, they didn't care who they sold. African, Middle Eastern, whites, they'd sell anyone. But once access to the East was cut off, it also cut off access to European slaves. So the slave trade became synonymous with Africans because they had more access to Africans than they had to Eastern Europeans. So one can wonder what would have happened if they had, at one time they did have both. On a couple of the islands, the Portuguese and the Spanish had some sugar islands off the coast of West Africa, and they had black and white slaves. But by the time they began sending slaves to the Americas, they were going to be Africans.
Thank you very much for that. I do have to say several people have posted in the chat that they would love to see session 2. So just know that everyone greatly appreciated your presentation. I want to thank you. Thank you so much, Harvey, for sharing this information and providing us this this webinar today. And thank you everyone for all the participants and attendees that participated in the chat and asked questions. We appreciate you all. And as a brief reminder, this is going to be posted in our CTL LibGuides for your reference to refer back to. And thank you all so much for your time.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.